So welcome everyone. As you're coming in, we're going to give people just another minute to get on. So just know that we're here and we're going to get started in just a few moments. All right, so I think we can get started. What do we think? So I want to welcome everybody. We have two different platforms that we're broadcasting this on. The first is Zoom, as we're watching people tick up and we're seeing people come on. But also I know that there's a lot of different people who are planning on being on YouTube as well. And so I want to welcome all those who are here on Zoom and all those who are here on YouTube. Tonight we're going to begin and we're going to have about a 45-minute conversation among the three of us. And then we're going to then take questions. We'll moderate mostly off of the Zoom call, though if you do post on YouTube, one person will be checking once later in the night and pulling those and giving those to us onto our Zoom platform as well. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to have our two other panelists introduce themselves too. I want to say also a word before I do about what brought us all together. So not only are we in a really challenging time, and loneliness being incredibly pervasive at this time, but this was a program that we were actually planning on doing before this all happened. So Eleanor Meeks, who is one of the people who runs the Bounce Festival, approached me and said, you know, the Bounce Festival, which is a festival, if you remember from last year, about optimism and hope, wants to kind of look at some of those roadblocks to optimism and hope and try to figure out, you know, especially around loneliness, what are ways in the face of loneliness that we can have optimism and hope? And so she had said, let's do a pre-session on loneliness and let's have an interfaith conversation. And then this happened, it became all the more important. So I want to thank Bounce for hosting this, and also the Montclair Public Library, which has also been very involved. And I want to say that Bounce is adapting, and like everyone, it's offering virtual ways to stay connected and meet the challenges of life's ups and downs. This one deals with an unanticipated consequence of our sheltering in place, which is loneliness, but there's a lot of other really great events coming up, and I want to invite you to like their Facebook page, go to their website, and see what they are. And so I now want to invite my co-panelists to say a little bit about yourself and where you serve and introduce yourself. So Ann, you want to go first?
Oh, all right. I'm Rev Ann Ralosky. I am in my 10th year at First Congregational Church in Montclair on South Fullerton Avenue. Last year we participated in Bounce in a variety of different ways and found it to be such an important, meaningful, and much needed way of connecting last year. And I think this year, with this particular circumstance, all the more. So I was very grateful to be asked to be on this panel. So thank you, Rabbi Marc. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I am Leslie Houseworth-Fields. I'm the pastor of St. Mark's here in Montclair, New Jersey. And I participated, and the Mark participated in Bounce last year, and we're excited to be a part of it again. I've had this conversation with a couple of different people about things that either started last year or are just starting this year, and we didn't know just how relevant they would be when we were planning them. And it feels almost providential. And so to be a part of this conversation in this particular moment is a great honor, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Wonderful. And I'm Rabbi Marc Katz. I am the rabbi at Temple Ner Tamid in Bloomfield, New Jersey. And I'm a resident of Montclair. This is an issue that's really kind of dear to me. A few years back, I actually wrote a book on Judaism and loneliness. It's called The Heart of Loneliness. And so it's something that I think a lot about, and it's something that, I feel like at this time, all the more so, we should be talking about it. So I want to begin by first kind of diagnosing the problem. And I'm curious with the two of you, and I'll jump in as well. Like, where do you see loneliness manifesting in your congregation? And don't just think about right now in light of COVID. Think about like before COVID. What were some of the times where like people came to you and like they used lonely as an adjective to describe how they're doing and how they're feeling?
What's interesting, and we know that this is well documented, particularly with psychologists and folks that work with youth, but a tremendous amount of isolation within our young people. The more connected virtually through screens, the more time on social networking platforms, the more isolated we find our young people becoming. One of the things that is such a gift in our congregation is a really remarkable youth group that we have, where it's sort of a check phones at the door oftentimes with these experiences for the kids, which at first is resisted mightily. But then they learn the real joy of being present to one another as human beings. And I think that there is a connection there between loneliness and the kind of anxiety that's pervasive within our teenagers. And a tendency or a diminished capacity to connect personally and empathetically when so much of interaction is done virtually or even just through text. I have to say Zoom can be a game changer. I can see your beautiful faces right now and I can, understand your energy a little bit. But when everything is done via text or other things, I think it does make us get too much inside our heads. And I think that is, of course, not just young people, but it's all of us. We get so much inside of our heads that we lose that sense of human connection, which is, I guess, is sort of the heart of combating loneliness.
And I think along those lines also, we are very connected virtually. Even before this, many of us were connected via social media or we FaceTime friends, but the relationships in many ways can feel superficial and there's not a lot of depth. So many of us have a lot of friends on social media, but we don't know those people very well. Right. And I've had some young people, especially even young adults, right, or people, I guess this still qualifies as young, but in our 30s say, I feel like I know so many people and I have so many friends and I've been so many places and yet I feel so lonely. And so I think sometimes people, even in the midst of the crowd, don't feel seen. And I've heard that. And on the other end of it, I've had the experience of some older people who perhaps are not working or not leaving the house every day going to work and having to grapple with this newfound sense of loneliness of how do I create community when I am not out and about as much as I once was, and really trying to find ways for the church, and I think we'll get to this more later, but for the church to be a place of community in a new way for folks who are experiencing loneliness just because of proximity.
Totally. What I'll say is that what you're saying, and are we going first name basis? Because I realized I never asked.
Absolutely. And it's great.
Yeah. So Leslie, what I noticed you say is something that, has actually been documented, especially among like young men. And so men my age, right? I'm 35 years old. The average man around my demographic in the 1950s and 60s had 4 people that they said were their friends, right? Close confidants that they could kind of open up to. Now the number is 0.8. And so like we live in this kind of wholly different world. And I found as a rabbi that like, I've seen loneliness hit every single aspect of like one's life, right? From couples trying to conceive and dealing with infertility, to people who are getting divorced, to people who are in bad marriages, to something that I hope that we're going to talk about later, which is the loneliness of the leader, because I feel like often I'm very lonely as like a rabbi, and I'm sure you are as well at certain points in your kind of work life. To, loneliness of sickness and death and all of that, right? And so for me, at least, like one of the things that I find, it's taken me a while to come up with a definition of loneliness that works for me. I came to it actually only after I wrote the book, which was loneliness is the space that exists between the person that you know yourself to be and the number of people that can see you in that fullness. Wow. So like, I'll explain what I mean by that. Like I originally started talking and thinking and writing about loneliness because before I got married to my current and last wife, Nelson, I was married once before. And so when I was going through my divorce, it was also the same time as the high holidays. And so everybody kept looking at me as the rabbi who was going through high holidays. Oh, you must be stressed out because of the high holidays. What are you going to talk about? All of this, right? And what I wanted to do is grab them and be like, why are you talking to me about something so stupid like the high holidays? My life is falling apart, right? And so like I had a reality, but I hadn't told anybody about it because there's a point when you're getting divorced where you don't yet talk about it. And I didn't have very many people in my life who could see me in my fullness, right? And so that chasm is the cause of loneliness. And my contention, I think, is that like that's the reason that any of those categories of loneliness are lonely itself, right? So I want to now turn to talk about, the specific loneliness that people are facing now. People open up to me. I'm sure they open up to you. Like, how are your congregants doing?
It's really, it's all over the map, really. There are some folks who are hunkered down with lots of family. And so that's a different kind of experience. That pressure can be different. You can never feel like you can get any solitude, which is a real distinct experience from loneliness, I think. And then we have those who are singles or seniors who are completely alone. And especially our seniors who are most vulnerable, where they have friends or family who are running errands for them, but they'll drop it off at the end of the driveway. There's this real sense of being untouchable, I think, for some of our folks in the moment. And that is that's a pain in the heart. Our congregation is a very, we're a very huggy congregation. We're a very communal and celebratory congregation. Our passings of the peace are just sort of go on forever. Our coffee hours, we call it the second hour of worship. It's like we are a very, very social congregation. And I know that people are really, they're having withdrawal from that. Yeah. I'm going to confess myself. At the end of a service, when it's hug after hug after hug, that's kind of, it's energy in my tank. And it's a different experience to be tending to people on the phone or on a Zoom call and not able to experience that physical touch, which is really an essential part of the human condition. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that real human touch, that human intimacy is an important part of our mental well-being and our spiritual well-being. So I think that there are, I know that there are folks really hurting in my congregation who are just feeling very separated from kind of that which gives them joy, which is the relationships that we share there.
Yeah, look, I hear you. I remember having a conversation with somebody who was telling me that, after they got divorced, they so missed the physical touch because you don't realize just how much you touch your spouse, right? That they actually would go and get chair massages like twice a week, just so someone was placing their hands on them in a way that was like, whether you call it loving or caring, like
nurturing, nourishing, yeah.
And now you can't even have that. That's
what's so cruel about this particular situation.
Yeah. How about you, Leslie? Where are you seeing it?
I've seen similar to Ann, people are all over the map. There are some people like me, I'm married, I have 2 kids, and so we have enough space. We're very fortunate to have enough space. I've always thought our house was too big until now. We have enough space where everybody can go and be in a separate room for a period of time and find that solitude. And so I feel very fortunate to have that. And at the same time, my kids are 7 and 8. So it's busy, busy, busy all day long. But then I have some people, when I talk to them, they're home alone day after day after day, and they feel a sense of loneliness. And sometimes when I speak with people, I've been trying to call people on the phone, and sometimes people with whom I've had a, hey, how you doing? Good to see you. God bless you. Have a great week relationship. We'll have a 45-minute conversation about nothing and everything, right? And not in a way where it's not a meaningful conversation, but it's like, we've never talked about sunsets, or we've never talked about really deep feelings. You know, it's always just been, hey, pastor, hey, so-and-so. So I have seen that as a ministry, because I realized, you know, if you're alone day after day after day, that can become very lonely. And it, I think, gives way to a lot of fear. And in some ways, it's like, I just don't have time to be afraid a lot of time. I mean, we are just so busy. We're doing remote learning. I feel like my kids eat 3 times as much as they ate before this, you know, like it's just a
Quarantine
busy
15
day.
is real. It's real.
Oh my gosh. So it's just a different place. And then there is the loneliness. We have a few people who live in senior, either like senior housing or nursing homes, and that is very lonely. And then people worried about their relatives, right, who are alone and feeling a sense of guilt, like I'm supposed to be doing something, and there's just not a lot that we can do. So that's been very difficult. I am aware that I don't think my congregation has yet found a way to minister to younger people in this moment. And I mean, I take ownership for that. And I think about my own kids and other kids, like, oh, how do we realize that they have needs and they experience these feelings too, even if they can't articulate them in the same way? And so I have been thinking a lot about, oh, how do we reach out to younger people? My daughter, who's 8, turning 9, has just been saying for the past few days, like, I'm just ready for this to be done. I'm ready to go back to school. I'm ready to go back to school, right? And she may not be able to say, I feel lonely, I feel afraid, but for her, she's over it, right? Like, she's like, I'm over this. So I imagine that is part of how it's manifesting in someone her age.
Good. So let's now talk about kind of, now that we've diagnosed the problem, let's talk about what to do about it, right? And the way that I see it, there are essentially 4 directions you can turn. And I would love to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these 4 different directions: up, out, in, and back. So I'll talk about each one and kind of like, and we'll brainstorm together, because I think that some of these are actually niches that only religion can offer. And so let's start actually with the religious stuff first, before we move into the practical stuff that a psychologist could easily talk about too. So I want to spend a little bit of time actually talking about back. One of the things that I often joke about was that, like, when I was, getting that divorce, like, I looked for every model in pop culture of people who were getting divorced, because, like, if I could find, if I could identify with Ross from Friends who was falling apart, then I was able to say to myself, well, like, at least I'm normal, right? And I began to find that actually, like, our religious tradition can offer those models too. That you can look back and you can find, for example, the loneliness of infertility. You can see that you're actually walking beside people like Hannah and Rachel, and people who, like, have actually really struggled. And that, like, finding in your history people who have struggled themselves gives you a companion in your pain that allows you to realize that what you're going through is normal. So for me, I've always found that it's a little bit case specific, but I've always loved, for example, Isaac, who after the death of his mother, Sarah, is 3 years later wandering, Lasuach Basadeh, wandering in the fields until he finally looks up and sees his future wife, Rebecca, because he's just so torn up. And, like, that image, like, I think gives permission for me, if I lose a loved one or someone else, to be torn up, like, way further than you need to be, right? Or not than you need to be, than people expect you to be, right? Or the idea that, that Hannah like has to like escape her house because unable to have kids. She's like facing Penina, who is this other wife that her husband is married to, seeing his kids with her and just saying like, I just can't take it anymore. And so she has to pray so deeply that in fact, a priest walks by and thinks she's drunk because her eyes are closed. She's just so in prayer. And I'm curious, like, what religious models do you have that like, when you look at them, you're like, you know what, like, I love their pain because it gives me permission to kind of feel that way too. And it allows me to study it and better understand my own pain that I'm feeling.
A really fascinating question, Mark. As I was thinking about and reflecting for this presentation, the story from the Christian tradition, from the Gospels, it's from the Gospel of John that kept coming up to me, was the woman at the Samaritan well. So the Samaritan woman at the well. It's a story in which a woman is out at a well at noon. She is a Samaritan. Noon is a very odd hour for a woman to go get water. They would go out in the cool of the morning all together as a community. Would have been a time not just for gathering water to bring back, but for socializing and sharing news and supporting one another. She's clearly not welcome in the morning. And so she's there on her own. And this story came up in our lectionary cycle at the beginning of this whole social distancing experience. And it really made me think she's always a solitary figure. Jesus is with his entourage. He's walking, teaching, and preaching, and doing a lot of healing. And they go off into a town to get some food, and he comes across this woman at the well. And against all of the rules and customs, he asks her about herself. And they start talking. And he's breaking all of these boundaries that were supposed to keep them apart. And she feels truly seen for the first time. And being seen is transformative for her. And so it makes me realize just how, and we sort of touched on this even early on when we were identifying people in our congregations, the ones who may not feel seen. So in her backstory, she's had 5 husbands, right? Well, what was that, what was happening there? Was she widowed over and over again? Was she cast out? Were there other situations where she was no longer accepted as a wife? Imagining kind of the loneliness of that backstory that she probably resigned herself to. But in this encounter with Jesus, for who us as Christians, in our tradition, we call him the human face of God. There is this sense that we are fully known, and being fully known is transformative. And so she goes back to her community saying, you just won't believe what happened to me just now. And there's a sense of she now has sort of an identity that feels whole again. And I think that's a big part of it. So for me, when I think about that sense of really social isolation, and social isolation with a sense of shame attached to it, right? Just how devastating that can be, and how life-giving that human touch, that human contact, and that validation that your story matters. And I recognize that this is not shameful necessarily, but tragic in some ways. And that was sort of game-changing for her.
I think about 2 things. One is a specific story, and I'll come back to that. But another is just the collection of Psalms. And there are periods in my life where my daily devotion will be the Psalms. And this is one of those moments, because I feel like there are just so many human emotions expressed in them, including loneliness. And I think about Psalm 139 in particular, and the psalmist articulating being seen. But I think that this is not said it out of confidence, or at least not initially, right? And just this idea, almost like when you have to coach yourself, that, okay, God is with me, I'm not alone. And I feel a sense of that. And so I just think reading through the Psalms reminds me, like, whatever I'm feeling, if I am feeling forgotten, if I'm feeling abandoned, if I'm feeling betrayed, if I'm feeling joy, whatever I'm feeling, that there are people who have felt this, not just the people who wrote this, but the people who have recited these Psalms over and over throughout the years. And then I think about the story of Hagar, when she and her son are sent away. It's like, here, take some water, bye, and and it seems that they both feel lonely. The story right there, so from her perspective, but both she and her son must be incredibly lonely together. And then it becomes so bad that she says, I can't watch him die. And she goes away from him, right? And how lonely each of them must feel in that moment. But then God says, I heard the boy crying, and makes provision for them. And Hagar is especially a figure that a lot of womanists look to in her story. This woman who is a concubine or a servant, right? Who really is not in control of her own life. And then she has a son with Abraham. So now she sort of seems to be elevated, and then all that is taken away, which I imagine then feels even worse than how she may have felt before. And just this incredible loneliness that a lot of Black women, I think, just feel living in the world at any given time that's not even COVID related. So that's a story where it's like, even in these moments where you feel so alone, when other people have sent you away, people who were supposed to care for you or protect you, that God sees you, right? And that where you are right now is not where you are right now.
Good. I love the Hagar story. I find it brings me a lot of comfort. I got some feedback from somebody that's saying that there's some clicking. That's not any of us typing. It's one of our computers, maybe with a cord loose or something like that. So I apologize for people with a little bit of clicking that's going on. So look, we're all inspired by these stories, but there's another avenue that I think is a worthwhile avenue to explore religiously, right? We just talked back, but let's talk up for a second. Up doesn't necessarily mean up. God could be anywhere. But this idea that, like, another thing that religious individuals have that I think is really worthwhile is that when people fail you, you have this other thing, right? Whether it's, you call it God or spirituality or the universe, that you can kind of connect with, that can, that hopefully can help you feel seen, loved, all the things that you want to feel when you are feeling lonely. And if you can develop that relationship somehow, I actually think that there's tremendous power in that to help you when people do fail you, and they will, right? It's gonna happen at certain points. Loneliness is a given in life. The question is, how long does it stick around for, and how acute is it? And so I'm curious also if the two of you want to talk a little bit about, about where you think God is in all of this, and spirituality and prayer, and how does that help?
One of the traditions, both certainly within the Gospels, and then it got carried on to the who we call the desert fathers and mothers, those early Christian mystics who left community, left society, and went out way into the desert because they felt that there were so many distractions within the social world that were coming between themselves and a real experience of the holy within them. And so they would go and sequester themselves out and learn how to deeply pay attention to the voice of God that was within them. And I think particularly in our modern society, we are given distractions at every turn. It's really easy to keep things superficial and move from one thing to another thing to another thing, and to feel tremendously lonely, even surrounded by every kind of stimulation imaginable. Because, Leslie, you really touched on it when you said that so many of the relationships that we might have in our lives are actually rather superficial. I think we can be as superficial with God as well. We can go through the motions of our religious traditions. We can show up at the events. We can use the language. We can do, but then we're really not paying attention to that inner voice that is trying to connect us to what is truly real with a capital R. And what's truly real is a combination of things that bring us joy and things that bring us pain. It's about the real heart of being human. And I think that because sometimes it's uncomfortable to really face the heart of being a human being and all that we carry with that we're very quick to move on to the next thing. So I some of the spiritual teachers who meant a lot to me, Thomas Merton, Henri Nouwen, these were folks who had a very rich inner life that helped them deal with the disappointments of folks that let you down, of circumstances that don't come out right, because they knew they weren't defined by those relationships, or weren't defined by that achievement, or, you know, whatever that might be, but that their real identity was that they were a reflection of God. They were a beloved and created being in God's image. And to listen to that voice of God within us sometimes means stepping away from a lot of the distractions. I think it's the polarity. There's loneliness and then there's solitude. And I think that when we can cultivate solitude as a practice, we feel more full as opposed to more empty, which I think is maybe a way loneliness can leave us feeling.
I mean, I love what you're saying there, because we talked about the back, the up, the in, right? Like learning to create something.
That's in, not so much up, right?
Yeah, I think is really important. I mean, I once heard it said that that one of the reasons meditation is so hard is that, like, when you shut out the outside world, you end up like in a phone booth with a crazy person and a megaphone. Right?
Yeah.
That's actually why meditation is difficult. And so, like, you have to learn to love the person that you're stuck in the phone booth with, because solitude becomes loneliness when you hate being alone.
Yeah.
And like learning to be able to do that, which, by the way, our like technology makes it so that you never are, right? The minute that I have like a second to myself, I'm on my phone rather than actually like being with me.
Absolutely.
And so you never learn that. So when you're stuck then doing it, it's like really difficult. Yeah. What do you think?
Think about turning up. So Lent started, I guess, a few weeks before the quarantine in New Jersey began. And I just kept saying to myself leading up to like the shutdown, I was like, listen, like, if we're going to shut down, I am not going to do anything. I'm done. Like, I'm not fasting anymore. I am done. I'm not getting up early anymore for these morning talks with God. Like, I'm done. And I was just so clear.
Lent enough, right?
Right. Like, that'll be Lent enough. And I didn't even feel like, I didn't feel guilty about that. I just felt like, if I have to stay home with my kids, like, that's enough of a sacrifice. And so I was just very clear about that. And the first week I was home, I was like, and I put myself like a pretty strict fast for Lent. And I was like, yeah, I'm done with that. And then as I was going through it, I was like, you know what? Instead of pulling away from my practices, this is the time that I need to lean into them. And one of the things that's very difficult to me about Lent is that, like, I don't always feel connected with God. And I remember last year I was saying, like, you know, I'm starving, I'm grumpy, I don't feel or hear God. And a few people from my, because I was like complaining. I was not doing what Jesus said about, like, wash your face and don't complain. Like, I was complaining to anybody who would listen. And a few people said, you know, we can tell that you're hearing from God. And so I have to remember that it's the discipline of it, even if I don't feel the results in the moment, right? You keep eating right and working out, like, you're going to get fit, even if you don't feel fit on your way home from the gym. And so I have found that in this moment, it's important for me. And I'm not saying this is for everybody, but it's important for me to continue those practices in ways where I connect with God, even if I don't feel it every day, but in the broad scheme of things that's happening. And it keeps me grounded. And it doesn't mean that I don't get anxious at times, or I'm not afraid at times, or I don't lose my cool at times. But I think, how much worse off would I be if I weren't still adhering to these practices, right? I don't necessarily know how much better it is, but I would probably be a whole lot worse if I weren't staying grounded and adhering to these spiritual practices and disciplines.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that so I struggle in a very similar way to what you're talking about, and in fact, actually, like, I don't know if it's the way that it is in your specific faith traditions, but liberal Jews, right, Reform Jews specifically, we really struggle with God. And part of the thing that makes Jews Jews is that, like, you don't even really need to believe in God to be Jewish. You could just, like, you keep the holidays, you eat some bagels, like, God doesn't need to be there. But so I've been, like, really challenging my congregants, at least, like, come on, like, try to figure it out. And where I am right now in my struggle, is that like I kind of feel like I believe in two gods simultaneously. It's the same God, I just can't unify them, right?
Mhm.
There's the God that I intellectually believe in, which is the one that's like far away, that doesn't have control of the universe, that like the Holocaust happened because God doesn't actually, like, God controls the big stuff, but like the fate of humanity is like not in God's hands, right? God just is a substance or something like that, right? But that's like not a great God when you're sick, because like that's not a God that holds your hand or hears you. It intellectually makes sense to me. I understand suffering in light of it. But then I have this other God that I pray to, that I need, that I felt, that's been in the room with me. And I can't reconcile the two. And I'm okay with that because I'm a postmodern person and it's okay to hold both of those at the same time. But I find that like, whether or not I know intellectually that God is listening to me, and sometimes intellectually I feel like God can't possibly be, that can't be the God that exists, I still feel heard when I pray.
Mm.
And there's this practice in Judaism called Hikbodedut by a rabbi named Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, where he went out into the wilderness and he basically like shouted at God for an hour, right? He just talked. And like, I've done that before. And like, I feel heard. Like, I think their universe somehow is listening to me, whether it's God or not. And so I feel like if being seen is the primary way to alleviate loneliness, like I actually do think prayer helps in that. I want to turn now to talk about community. One of the big problems with the way that religious groups often attack loneliness is that they think that if you get a group of people in the room together, that's going to fix things. And in fact, every one of us have been around people, maybe like on a subway or something, right? And proximity to people, if that was what was going to fix our loneliness, the greatest place in the world would be a crowded subway car. So like there has to be something else besides going to a vibrant program or a great service that's going to cause you to feel like, like you are less lonely. I'm curious, like, what is the unique place of religion in terms of the out, right? In terms of connecting people, of allowing people to really be seen, of taking away the facade. Because if that's the thing that's going to help with loneliness, we actually have a certain pathway into vulnerability that the rest of the world doesn't by being. And I'm curious, like, what tools do you have in order to connect people in the ways that actually do alleviate loneliness? And secondly, how do you modify that for the world that we're living in right now?
Yeah, the word religion comes from the Latin word religio, which means to bind together. So religion is a practice that binds us together. And it's through common stories, right? The big story that we're telling each other about who we are in the scheme of creation, who we are in relationship to God and one another, and finding our place in those stories, I think is what gets underneath the superficiality and kind of hits to the heart of being human. We also have at the heart of our faith kind of the embodiment of human vulnerability, both spiritually and physically. Jesus was an individual who suffered greatly emotionally and physically, and sort of made that sacred and okay, and a way of connecting with other human beings. And so I think that and we do certainly. We have opportunities to tell each other stories. We, within small groups, within even book studies or Bible studies, or we have a variety of sort of spiritual circles that get underneath kind of the intellectual stuff and really tap into what does it mean to be a human being. And there's deep kind of personal revelations that happen in those small communities. There's a great deal of trust. Of seeing and being seen, and that I think is I have the strange experience of back when we used to gather. Remember those days when we'd like walk someplace and walk into a building?
Maybe.
We used to go into our sanctuary back in the olden days, where people would contact me in the week and say, "Oh, I'm not going to be at church. I just wanted to let you know." And I'm thinking to myself, I don't take attendance. Well, actually, I kind of do, but I'm not keeping score. But there was a sense of I'm going to miss something if I'm not there. Like I'm going to miss a wonderful story or experience or something. And I think it's been challenging to create that virtually. I think we have done it. We've transferred some of our small groups online. I think it's closer than not. It's certainly a good attempt. And a lot of people do walk away feeling seen, heard, and loved, even on the screen. But it's lacking the energy and that sense of connection.
I think one of the ways that we connect through become community and really tap into that vulnerability is in death, because a religious place is a place like that's for many people, this is when you experience a death, when someone in our midst dies or they lose a loved one, like we really gather around. And so like we all end up taking a turn being vulnerable in that way. And now that like we are here, people are dying and we're not able to gather in that way, I realize just how important it has been for us to gather. And little things we do, like getting together and people bringing food and serving the food and all of these ways that we love each other, I realize has opened us up in a very unique way where it may not be appropriate in the same way in some other places. Another thing I've been thinking about is the worship service, which I appreciate the worship service. I really enjoy preaching, but I have been preaching from my living room and have just kept saying to myself, like, you're surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses. You're not preaching by yourself, but it's like me and my cell phone, and it feels really weird. And I've realized that I don't preach for the amens, but especially in my context, there's this call and response element of it where I get a sense of, is this touching people either by their reaction or lack of reaction, right? Like sometimes it's like the nervous, like, oh gosh, like I'm not going to react because this is hitting close to home. And in my preaching, I try to be vulnerable, right? Like I don't tell all of my business, but like I use some self-deprecating humor sometimes, and like saying like, I'm not preaching from what I have achieved, like it's aspirational, right? Or this is who I'd like to be. And it has been very lonely to not have that feedback, even as I preach, or to wonder like, I think this is what people can use this week, but I have not been able to. So I didn't realize just how vulnerable we were together in the actual worship service.
Totally. I mean, I've seen you preach and I've seen people literally respond to you, which is a different, I think, tradition than I would say synagogues where people just kind of sit cold faced at you and maybe you get a smile every once in a while. But to have people like call and response, even like, not even be able to see that is like, it's difficult. It's really hard. For me, like one of my heroes in the Bible is a woman whose name is the Witch of Endor, which is like a very minor character in the book of Samuel, for those who don't know. Saul, the king, comes to her and he wants to find out whether he's going to win like this battle. So he asks her to basically like conjure up the prophet Samuel, who's now dead. And so she brings him back from the dead. And Samuel basically says to Saul, like, why'd you wake me up? Oh, and by the way, you're going to die tomorrow. And then he leaves. And the Witch of Endor, realizes when Saul falls on his face that he's just forlorn. And what does she do? She basically cooks him dinner and hangs out with him. Like she doesn't say anything to comfort him. Because she doesn't have the words, right? All she does is she to use a different metaphor, like climbs into a hole with him and just like sits in the dark with him. And I find that actually yes, people have to be brave enough to open up if they're really going to kind of bridge the gap between the person they know themselves to be and the person that you are. But also like we can facilitate people at least just being present, right? Yeah. And that might be during Shiva Minyanim for Jews. You gather for the 7 days after a loved one dies, and you sit with them and you're there with them. It might just be calling them up and just like being like just saying like I'm here. Studies have shown, by the way, that the number one thing that stops suicides right before they're about to start is a well-timed text. And the text doesn't have to say, please don't commit suicide. It might just be like, hey, what are you doing for dinner, right? It's like, it's someone who loves you reaching out to you and like reminding you that there are people who love you in the world. And that's actually the number one thing that's been shown to like stop suicides. And so like the more that we can set up so that people feel loved through those interactions. And so we're, for example, having every member of the congregation get a phone call from a board member. And then if you're over 80, we stagger that. So it's once a month with a board member, and then once every other week with, if you're over 80, with somebody from our Chesed committee, which is our loving kindness committee, just to make sure that people are keep checking in so that they know people care about you, they love you, they're here for you. And if they want to talk to you, if they don't want to talk, at least that touch means like you are loved, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious, actually, you know, we've talked about the up, we've talked about the back, we've talked about the out. We've talked a little bit about the in, but I know, and one of them is learning to kind of love yourself and get a sense that you can be alone. But another is like having a mission, right? If you feel like you have a cause in the world, I think that can also help bridge the gap when people fail you. And I'm curious if you have some thoughts about religion's place in that, and maybe even what our cause could be now, because like we can't go work in a soup kitchen always and stuff like that.
Right. I do think feeling a sense of purpose is, well, it makes you feel connected to the human race. You know, it makes you have an outlet for your gifts. It helps you experience and be grateful for the gifts of others, you know, working in community and having a common cause and a common bond. I mean, certainly caring for one another is something that congregations do, but I think it's always important to look beyond just our church family, our insular family, and how can we be a force for good, a force for connection, a force of hope within the wider community. It is more challenging now because we do have to be so careful about actual interactions. But there have been ideas percolating, certainly in our congregation. I know that even among our youth, who never cease to inspire me with their generosity of spirit, wanting to take on a program to help bring foods to elders at First Montclair House, you know, do grocery shopping for folks and other things like that, make cards for people. It might seem small. I mean, we can also get behind those of us who, and this is a very dicey situation for so many people economically, but if you feel you still have a firm economic foundation in your life, can you be donating to organizations who do have a good system for being in touch with people and making real difference in terms of people's sense of isolation and loneliness? This might be a time, I don't usually preach this, but this might be a time where our checkbooks, you know, need to be making a difference if our hands can't. You know, I do tend to want our community to be hands-on with how they're caring, but sometimes what a few of us may have is the ability to support a cause that had not seemed that important to us before. But I think the idea that we are bonding together around a force for good, even when people remind me that the streets are empty and all these kinds of things, because we're at home, and we're at home because we're caring. We're disciplining ourselves so that others might live. That's not nothing. I mean, it feels sometimes fruitless and frustrating, but it's not nothing. It's actually quite a sacrifice. And I think if we can imagine all the people that we love who are separated from us by walls and yards and streets and towns, that we are all of one heart in this, I think that makes it bearable.
I read something interesting. One of my colleagues, her father has been in prison for 17 years. And so she said, you know, she kept hearing people saying like, I feel like I'm in prison. And at first it was really annoying her because it's like, actually, I know somebody in prison. This is not that. But then she said, you know, let me reach out to my dad and just see what he has to offer to us. And so he had this list, and I'm going to just share a little bit from it. And I think what it points to is having purpose. So he is a person of faith. So he said, wake up praying every day, giving thanks to whom you believe in, fasting, so those disciplines throughout the day or week, talking to loved ones, reading daily, exercising, talking on the phone, having dinner discussions or cooking together, developing a daily routine, getting adequate sleep, and then praying again. And so I hear in that like this connection and just making sure that you have a sense of purpose, that you're staying connected, that you have some discipline. And I thought that was very interesting. And she wrote that he has spent some time, I think he spent like a year in solitary confinement, and just the importance of having something, because it's very easy for me to just say like, you know, I'm not even gonna like wash today. Do I need to brush my teeth? I'm not gonna be around anybody. And then I'll say like, you need to do this for you, right? Like you need to make sure that you take care of yourself and for you. Otherwise I can become, you know, I can start feeling like nothing, it doesn't even matter. I might as well not do whatever,
Right.
you know, and feeling kind of hopeless. And because as you said earlier, Mark, like we're not immune to feeling, to experiencing loneliness. And I think it happens, right? It's not that I'm saying like, I never want to experience loneliness, but how do I not be overcome by it?
Totally. So I want to ask one final question, because I know that we're at our time, and I do want to open it up for people to ask questions. And by the way, if you want to ask questions, by all means, feel free to do that in the chat function. And if you have reflections, it looks like, for example, Ib Kuferman like wanted to open up. Feel free to type whatever you want. We'll read it, and then we'll be able to interact and react that way. This is not, and I apologize if people thought this was a support group. This is more of an information sharing session. But feel free to open up in the chat, and we'll make sure to interact with you in that way. There is a unique kind of loneliness to being a faith leader. And I'm finding that there are ways right now where I'm feeling like I'm really held by my community. And I'm feeling that right now, there are also ways where all the things that cause faith leaders to feel lonely is happening just at a magnified pace with all the deaths and sickness that we're dealing with now. And I'm curious, just, you know, like, if you want to reflect a little bit on like, what does it mean to be a faith leader at this time? And like, where are the points of loneliness for you?
I can speak to this. I feel like, and I had this woman from a church where I served once, and we were, I think, as much of friends as we could be for me to be one of her pastors, if that makes sense, right? Like we could go out and just have an incredible conversation with each other, have a great time. And so one day we were having drinks together, and she said something like, it must feel great to have so many friends. And I was like, oh, I don't actually have a lot of friends. And she paused and she said, you know, it never really occurred. Like, she said, it never occurred to me that when we go out, I talk to you about all of my life, but like, you don't do the same thing, right? And so there are these moments where it's not that it's not sincere, but it's like, it's actually not appropriate for me to just like tell you everything that's happening in my marriage at the moment, or like every frustration I'm having, right? So like I can share, but only up to a point, right? Before it's like, people are like, I don't know that I really needed to know that. And so that can be very lonely. And where the relationships where it is appropriate for you to share in that way. And so I've tried to just cultivate friendships outside of the church, or to be very intentional about maintaining friendships with people who knew me before. Yes. And wholly outside of Pastor Leslie.
Yeah, that's completely key. That's really key. I came into ministry in my 40s, so I had a long history and circle of friends who knew me before, including my husband, which is really important that he doesn't think of me as Pastor Ann at ever. It's you know, and I think that's good to have that balance in your life, because you know, Leslie, as you said, I think our humanity is really important for our congregation, and I think in lots of ways, as you say, you preach vulnerably, and I think I do too. But at the same time, there is definitely a point past which you don't let people in. And it's not my congregation's job to support me. It's my job to support them. And obviously it's more than a job. It's a calling, and it's a passion, and it's something I love deeply. But it really isn't a two-way street, and it's not supposed to be. Mm-hmm. But that does leave you sometimes, because we spend so much time with our congregations, that the time to cultivate outside friendships is small. So I treasure those folks who knew me before, who know me so well, who can call me on my stuff, which is really, really important when you're in any position of leadership, people who really speak truth to you. But I do find in this particular situation that the need for pastoral care is ratcheting up. The need. We have not yet had funerals associated with this, and I'm certainly grateful for that. But I know, in the days, months to come, there certainly may be that burden can feel pretty heavy to be holding it all for everyone else, and not really having a place to lay it down. So I think making sure that we do have strong relationships outside of our role as leaders is the most healthy thing we can do for each other. I also have a great circle of clergy friends who, our clergy, our Micah, I'm going to put a plug for the Montclair Interfaith Clergy Association. It is great to be able to share with people who understand. It's really great.
Totally, yes. One of the other things, because you spoke about everything I would say, and at the same time, there's a story that I often reflect on, and it's not in the Bible itself. It's our ancient rabbis talk about it. In what is called Midrash, which is basically fan fiction by the rabbis on the Talmud. I mean, on the Torah. I love that. And basically, what they say is that when Moses is up getting the Torah from God, the people get nervous and they build a golden calf, right? And they ask Aaron to do it, who's Moses's brother. And there's this character whose name is Hur, H-U-R, who is a major player in the Bible up until that point. He's standing in Moses's right hand when Moses is fighting the Amalekites, and he goes up and sees God's feet earlier in the Torah, right? He's a big deal guy, and he just disappears. And so the rabbis imagine that the people first went to Hur to ask him to build the golden calf. Hur said no, so they killed him. And then they turned to Aaron and they said, build us the golden calf. And Aaron looks at Hur's body lying on the ground and says well, I guess I got to do this, right? And by the way, Midrash is authoritative in Judaism. It's not as authoritative as the text itself, but it's important. And I always find that that idea of me being a conduit to something else rather than a person is something that sometimes occurs, right? That people see me in my role, and sometimes people mistake me for God. I once walked into a wedding at the same time that there was a hurricane happening, and 2/3 of the guests had disappeared, and immediately got yelled at for something I didn't do. And I realized no, the mother of the groom isn't upset at me. She's upset at God for bringing this hurricane, and I'm the closest thing that
You're
she
a good
has.
stand-in, Mark.
And so losing me to the crisis. And I do have to say, actually, that I think I've been seen more during this crisis than perhaps any other time. People are really we have had so many deaths. I would say 4 times the number of deaths in our community, if you count parents and people and stuff, than we would on a normal month. And people have been reaching out and just saying, how are you? Which is, I think, actually a really kind of unique thing for clergy to get, because often you're lost in your role. You lose your personhood for your role. So that's been actually really helpful. We have our first comment. So this is Debbie, not Warren, even though it says Warren. I'm not, and by the way, feel free, everybody write. I'm not a lonely person, but I'm a social person. And the idea of not being able to host any kind of person-to-person gatherings for as long as 2 years fills me with despair. I hear you, Debbie. I'm sure all 3 of us do. So I want to turn every comment, if I can, into a question, which is if you catastrophize the future, if you take timelines very far, it can look like this is never ending. It can look really hard. The way to deal with this feeling, Debbie, that you have is to be able to live in the moment and figure out, am I okay now, rather than look too far into the future? Because if you do, it only spins out of control. The definition of anxiety, right, is telling a story that just doesn't end until finally it just gets to this horrible ending, right? And so I'm curious, what do you 2 do that allows you to stay in the moment so that you don't say things like, I'm going to be alone forever, but rather I'm alone right now?
Well, I think it's so important, and you did this, Mark, when you first addressed the question, is acknowledging the reality of that feeling, right? This is unprecedented. for the last 100 years, for people to be looking at this kind of disruption and isolation, it is frightening, and it is devastating on an emotional level. And I think it's okay to say that, but I think you're exactly right. We are not in control of the duration or the severity of any of this. I mean, we can take the steps we're taking, hopefully smartly, to minimize the potential for this to expand. But I think learning to pay attention to the moment is a way of not getting ahead of ourselves and letting our minds really get ahead of ourselves. And I think that is one of the healthiest things that we can do. Find small joys in the day. Find small rewards for exercising, for reading those 3 chapters, for writing that sermon, for doing whatever your work is, that just helps you go from moment to moment. Because I think if we do look too far ahead, it can have that sort of emotionally paralyzing effect on us. So living as much as we can in the moment, picking up the phone, it is no substitute for having, dear friends over, but picking up the phone. I had a lunch with someone on Zoom the other day. We made sure we had our food in front of us. We talked about what we were eating. We tried to make it as much of a real sharing as we could, like we were out to lunch together. Just learning those techniques.
I try to, there's that saying, like, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. And I deal with anxiety. And like one of the biggest things that I think I have experienced and heard from other people is like my fear of increased anxiety, right? Gives me anxiety. And so I have tried to do, as you mentioned, Mark, to think about just like, am I okay right now? Okay, so let me chunk even my week into the next. What would I like to accomplish over the next 3 days? Okay. So I have stopped trying to plan. I mean, even at church, I had a conversation with some colleagues this morning and I was like, yeah, I don't even want to have a conversation about August because there's no way to know what we will be able to do in August. There's just no answer for that. And I know myself, it's like, I'll just get worked up fretting about it. So I try to just think like, what do I know? What can I control? I was that person. I did not hoard toilet paper and paper towel, but I bought like every frozen vegetable I could find. And it's like, you know what? Like you can go shopping again in 2 weeks if you need to. Calm down, right? And just not allowing the fear of the future to send me into a panic today. But if I do think about that far out in response to Debbie, I get it, and so I've just been trying to manage my anxiety by like, here are the next couple of days, and this is what I can afford to think about, and then I'll go from there.
Yeah. And Debbie wrote again, she says, I do have many distractions, often meaningful during the day, but sometimes I back up and see the big picture. The other thing I would say, Debbie, is that like, first of all, like I think everybody at this time should watch, as crazy as this is going to sound, everybody should watch Inside Out, because I think it's got this profound lesson to teach us for our time. And if you've never seen
the movie,
Inside
right? That's the Pixar movie.
Yeah. The big message of Inside Out is that like sadness has a place. And the kind of the truth in that is that like, I truly believe that like, you can only go as high as you let yourself go low. And by the way, that's also the reason that like people who have bipolar disorder can go so high and so low. But like, if you blunt your emotions, if you say to yourself like, all right, I just have to get through this. I just have to be strong. Like, I'm not going to let myself fall apart. Like you also, by blunting the low emotion, will also blunt the high emotion that you're going to feel at certain points when you are here. So like, you have to carve out the space for really feeling that sadness, because if you do, like you'll allow yourself to have the highs, and if you push it down, it will find other unhealthy ways to come out. Now you just have to figure out like the avenues for it. Like the thing I love about Judaism is that there is like a prayer every single service called the Kaddish, where like you are supposed to be sad because you remember those who died, and you say their name and you say a prayer over them, right? so carving out those moments in your life and in your day, like to be profoundly sad or to feel profoundly lonely, means that like you get it out and then you're able to just carry on rather than it crippling you. And so I do think also that that's a really important thing that every single one of us can do, is finding those avenues to feel those ways.
Yeah. To quote the great saint Fred Rogers, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. So if we can put language to it, we can then wrap our hearts and minds around it. And so to be able to speak what is making you feel anxious, lonely, despairing in this moment, to give it a name, lift it up into the light, right? The stuff that we keep so deeply inside ourselves, that's where it starts to fester and take on a life of its own. But it's to find a place for it and to bring it out and to say, I'm feeling this. It's valid for me to feel this, and I'm going to sit with it and honor it. Gives us sort of a sense of, at least I know that it does for me, it gives me a sense of saying, this is just part of the whole picture of who I am right now, and I don't want to ignore it. And you know, if you can mention it, you can manage it.
We have another comment. This is from Diana. Hi, I belong to Ner Tamid. I think it's important that we, the congregants, be supportive and nurturing to our rabbi and cantor. There can be loneliness in being the leader put on a pedestal. What do you think? We spent a lot of time actually talking about us. I want to turn it around to talk about some of our congregants again. The idea of being on a pedestal, like what would you say to some of your congregants who have the loneliness of struggling to like keep their businesses afloat, or like being the CEO and trying to decide like, who am I going to fire? And it's like all up to them, right? Like what would you say to them, and what's our role in helping them to like navigate this?
I would say it's okay not to know at times. I think one of the pressures of being a leader in whatever capacity is that people are looking to you for answers, right? What do we do? Should we close or should we open? What should I do about this or that? And sometimes, you know, it's like, it doesn't feel professional to say it. Maybe we find a better way to say it, but it's like, I don't know. There was a meme on social media, like, your pastor has never pastored through a pandemic, right? Be patient with them. And I think if you are a business owner, you know, or whatever it is that you do, you've more than likely, unless you're just like very old, like you haven't done that through a pandemic. And so to be gracious with yourself when you aren't quite sure of what to do, and not to try to come off that pedestal in destructive ways, but sometimes being able to say, you know, I'm not sure right now what we're going to do, but I'm going to research this and come back to you. Right? I'm going to try to find the best information I can and come back to you. I think it's not what, you know, we don't get to kind of say like, throw your hands up. I don't know. I'm never going to think of it again. Right. But I'm going to do my best to find out what's available and make the best decision. And I think that, you know, we see leaders in our community doing that, and just to be gracious with yourself. It's okay if you don't know. You know?
Right. Right. I think what folks need most from leaders, whoever they are, is honesty. And honesty not only in being factually honest, but honesty in also being able to say, I don't know how this is going to turn out. I don't know what the right decision is. You know, there's so many factors of weighing. Again, this is in nobody's manual. It's in no business person's manual. It's in no pastor's manual. It's in no professor's manual. It's in no parent's manual, right? There's none of this. And I think that as the world was kind of doing this, that 1 week in March, where every day there was a new sort of extreme in terms of closing down, my mantra for myself was lead with love and let the rest sort itself out. And I know that as a pastor, that's something we can do because we are about our relationships with people. For a CEO or someone who's got responsibility for payroll and for, you know, other processes, I know that, you know, leading with love may not be the best strategy, but then maybe it's lead with ethics, lead with integrity, whatever that is that says to you, I'm honoring the situation that we're all in. I'm recognizing that there are going to be no winners here. How can I make sure that everyone's dignity humanity and safety are first in my mind, knowing that there will be bad and hard choices. But I think if we face into that, people will be able to feel that if they're on the side of a hard choice, if they're impacted by a hard choice, that they were seen. Again, going back to that their humanity was seen in the process of making this difficult decision.
Totally. So I'm mindful of the time. We have one more, we actually have two more questions. I'll read both questions, and then we can kind of react to how we want to do that. There, by the way, for those who are on YouTube, I never got sent any YouTube questions. So if they're there, I apologize. Or maybe there just aren't YouTube questions. But I'll read the first from Sal and then from Lisa Korn, and then we can respond to these, and then we will say thank you. So from Sal, I felt incredibly anxious at being lonely and away from the church, especially during Easter. But having a few family members home, then actually becoming infected, I have had to spend this last week being away from them as well and being only alone. It has been a very reflective time, but I wonder how to find meaning in it without becoming overly down, and also feeling like I haven't wanted to reach out to be being afraid to feel like I am putting my depression off on others. What do I do? And here's the other question. One of the most empowering things is to feel you're in control of your destiny. Right now, there's such a sense of being out of control, unable to even know where we're headed, and distrusting of those in charge at the federal level of this pandemic. It really puts me in a space to fear that we're going to be at the effect of those who are in fact don't have our best interests in mind. That's actually very frightening and makes me feel stranded. So there's a lot there in both comments. I want to talk first about Sal, and then maybe I'll say something to Lisa, and then I'll throw it over to you to say anything else that you want to say to these two. The first for Sal is, look, people are going to disappoint you. They do sometimes. But one of the challenges is that you cannot deal with loneliness or depression, but really loneliness, without reaching out to other people. And there's a quote in Judaism that just as the cow wants to drink, so just as the calf wants to drink, so the cow wants to nurse. Your family and friends want to be there for you. They are feeling helpless. And if you give them an avenue in this world to actually do something to be helpful, like they will jump at it. And so like, it's scary to be vulnerable. But if you allow yourself to be, the far majority of the people will respond to you, even if the first person or two doesn't. And so I would say just keep having the courage to reach out. And it takes courage to do that.
It does.
Because you will find that there are people who will respond and will reciprocate. And when they do, you will be able to at least have a few people that you can bridge the gap between the person you know yourself to be and others. Most people probably don't know that you're depressed. If you are able to talk about that with a few select people in your life, at least you've got people that you're not hiding that secret from. And then you don't have the shame, because secrecy is the greatest feeder of shame. And if you take away the secrecy, shame has nothing to latch onto. I'll say to Lisa that, you're right. It's really frightening to not know what's going to happen, and to not feel like people have the answers for you, and just to lean into that, because if you pretend it's not there, it's only going to eat at you more. It's kind of like sadness, that anxiety, that fear. And the more that you can acknowledge it, the more that you can feel it, the more you can lean into it, the more likely you are to at least be able to control it a little bit. And the more that you can name something, the more that you can control it, and the more that you're able to interact with it. I'm curious if the two of you have anything to say to Lisa or to Sal.
To Sal, I just want to echo what Mark said, and especially about depression. And if you are able to find other resources, even to not go through it alone. I think when people are dealing with depression, we often we sort of withdraw, which then can make us, we begin to feel even more lonely. And so to just, as Mark was saying, to reach out and share with people and to ask for help. Like there's nothing to be ashamed or even apologetic about, right? Like it's not something to feel guilty about. It's just something that we wouldn't feel guilty if we had a cold, right? Like it's just something to ask for help with. And then about feeling like we're out of control, I do have that feeling. Sometimes I try to remind myself that there was actually so much that you were never in control of in the first place. But that doesn't, I don't know that that brings a whole lot of consolation. I think about the movie, it came out a few years ago with Brie Larson, Room, about the woman who was kidnapped. And I remember how she got up and she had this routine every day with her son. And it reminds me of this feeling of there's so many things I can't control. And like whatever little bit I need to do in this moment to feel okay, I'll do those things, right? And so if I can exercise a little bit, I can control that. Like, we don't have a lot of control about the day-to-day decisions of our federal government at this point, right? We can go to the polls in November and express how we feel, but there's a lot of time between now and then, and a lot of things can happen. And so I am in no way like dismissing those feelings. I share them, I experience them, and what can we do, right? And finding ways to channel our energy that are positive and productive, and trying not to focus as much on the feeling of being out of control.
Good. And I'll give you the last word.
Sure. I just want to say hi, Sal. Yeah, it's as I think any of us who have struggled ourselves or have been close to people who have struggled with depression, it can have that self-perpetuating internal experience where one of the most awful things about it is it takes away sort of our sense of agency, that we are worth reaching out, that we have the energy to reach out, and that if we do, that people will receive us with love. And I think that moving ourselves through that block and remembering, Sal, especially from church, remembering all of the faces, all of those people. If you are the Sal who I think you are from my church, who would light up when you would come in and who would be so excited to see you each Sunday. Those faces are still there. We're just behind a screen or on the other side of a phone. And I do know that people have been checking in, but it sometimes just feels like you want to put on a little bit of a happy face to say, no, I'm good. It's really okay to say I am not good. I'm feeling ill. I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling weak. I'm not okay. Please say you're not okay when you're not okay. That is the most important thing that you can do for all of us, who love you and who love everyone who is feeling lonely, and that includes ourselves. It's okay for us as pastors to say we're not okay. I had a moment today where I wasn't okay, and I had someone to talk to about it, and it made all the difference. So just do remember and picture those faces in your mind, and remember how much love is there for you at the other end of whatever technology is available for you. In regards to the anxiety, I have to put myself on a media diet. I have to stop. I have to stop watching the news as much as I have been. Part of it is that I feel like if I can just find that good news, or I can find that moment where things make sense, it's really what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to control. I'm trying to get all the information I can. But our particular leadership situation right now, I end up feeling far more anxious and frustrated than if I turned on something else. I can find everything I need in the morning paper. And I really just need to limit my intake of what it is that makes me anxious. And that is something we can control. I obviously none of us are working in government right now, and we don't have the means to affect real change at that level. But we can affect how much we take it in and how much we let it affect us. So it's regaining a little bit of control and taking care of ourselves and recognizing what our limits are and what triggers us, and saying, I don't have to participate in that today. I can look at that beautiful sunset. I can take that walk. I can play with the dog. I can have a cup of tea with my child. I can do whatever, instead of putting ourselves in that frustrating situation. We do have that kind of control. We don't have control of much, but that we can do.
I feel like that's the way to end. And so, Ann and Leslie, I want to say thank you to the two of you for your thoughtfulness, but also for your vulnerability and your candor which I think really helped add so much to this conversation. So again, if you came in a bit late, this is part of the Bounce Festival, which is going to be changing tact and moving online. It's a festival of hope and optimism. And I think that, there was a lot, even though we were talking about loneliness, to find hope in the fact that we do have these tools at our disposal to really help to address the loneliness in our lives. And, for those on this call, know that we're here for you as clergy in your area, that we care about you and that we love you. And we look forward to walking this path through you. So I leave you with this one story. It's a story by Chaim of Sants that, two men are walking alone in the forest, and one man comes to another and says, "Can you help me? I don't know my way out." And the second man looked at him and said, "I too am lost. I don't know my way out. But what I do know is the path from which I came leads nowhere. So let us join hands and walk together." So I hope together, all of us can find our way out of this dark forest.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Marc, for hosting this. And I think I need to get your book on loneliness.
Thank you. The Heart of Loneliness.
Yes.
Judy can help you find comfort. All right. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.